Snow fell upon Ashworth Manor with the quiet persistence of winter in December 1847, transforming the Yorkshire estate into something from a fairy tale, all crystal and silence and impossible beauty. The manor itself stood like a monument to England's titled elite, its limestone facade adorned with ivy that had witnessed 3 generations of Ashworth prosperity, its windows blazing with candlelight as servants prepared for the annual Christmas ball that would draw nobility from 3 counties. In the east wing, far from the magnificent ballroom where chandeliers were being polished to diamond brilliance, Miss Eleanor Hartley stood before a narrow window in the schoolroom, watching footmen carry in hothouse flowers, while her 2 young charges practiced their letters behind her. She was 26, an age when most women of good family would have been married for years, but Eleanor existed in that peculiar limbo reserved for gentlewomen fallen on misfortune, too educated to be a servant, too impoverished to be anything else. Her appearance suggested quiet competence rather than beauty. Brown hair pulled back severely, grey dress chosen for its practicality, posture that spoke of dignity maintained through sheer will. Yet there was something in the fine bones of her face, the unconscious grace of her movements, that hinted at a different life once lived. She turned from the window as little Catherine fumbled with her pen. "Like this, darling," Eleanor said, guiding the child's hand with infinite patience, her voice cultured and gentle. The children adored her, which was perhaps the only warmth in her carefully constructed existence. She had been their governess for 3 years, ever since circumstances had forced her into this position, and she performed her duties with the quiet excellence that made her simultaneously indispensable and invisible to the household. Downstairs, the transformation continued, the ballroom that had stood silent since last Christmas, now awakening to music and laughter, to the rustle of silk and the sparkle of jewelry, to all the glittering excess that marked society's winter celebration. Eleanor had once loved such occasions. In another life, before her father's death and the discovery of debts that swallowed her modest dowry whole, she had danced at balls like this one, her feet remembering the patterns of country dances and waltzes, her heart light with the particular joy of being young and cherished and full of possibility. She had been trained in music and dance as befitted a gentleman's daughter, had spent hours at the pianoforte while her mother smiled, approval, had twirled before mirrors in gowns now long sold to pay creditors. That girl felt impossibly distant now, separated from this Eleanor by more than 6 years, separated by the chasm between hope and resignation, between visibility and shadow. As evening approached and the first carriages began arriving, their wheels crunching through fresh snow, Eleanor gathered the children and led them to the nursery for supper. They passed servants carrying champagne, glimpsed ladies in jeweled gowns ascending the grand staircase, heard the orchestra beginning to tune their instruments in distant rooms. Catherine begged to watch the dancing, just for a moment, but Eleanor gently refused. "That world is not for us, my dear," she said, and felt the truth of it settle like ice in her chest. Dancing, joy, the freedom to be seen and celebrated, these were luxuries she had relinquished the day she accepted a governess's wages. She had learned to find satisfaction in smaller things, a child's progress in Latin, a perfectly organized lesson, the security of a position that kept starvation at bay. As music began to float through the manor's corridors, Eleanor retreated to her small room in the governess' quarters, closing the door on the sounds of revelry, on the life she would never again inhabit, on the part of herself that still remembered how it felt to dance. The Duke of Thornwall arrived 3 hours after the ball had commenced, his carriage drawing up to Ashworth Manor with the casual lateness of a man whose title exempted him from ordinary courtesies. Sebastian Ashworth was 32, unmarried despite considerable pressure from his mother and society at large, possessed of a fortune that rendered him independent of anyone's opinion, and a reputation for being as discerning as he was cold. He moved through the world with the particular confidence of those born to power, his dark evening clothes impeccably tailored, his manner suggesting he attended such gatherings not from pleasure but from the dutiful acknowledgement that his position required certain performances. His brother, Lord Edward Ashworth, greeted him with relief tinged with exasperation, for Sebastian's presence lent considerable prestige to any occasion, even if his demeanour suggested he would rather be anywhere else. The ballroom swirled with colour and music, ladies in silks that caught the candlelight like jewels, gentlemen in formal black, creating a moving pattern of elegance and excess that Sebastian observed, with the detachment of someone watching a theatrical production rather than participating in life. He danced when propriety demanded, conversed when courtesy required, his responses perfectly calibrated to maintain social harmony while revealing nothing of his interior landscape, which was considerably more complex than the bored aristocrat he appeared to be. It was during one of these obligatory circuits around the ballroom that his gaze happened to catch a figure moving through a corridor, visible through the open doors, a woman in grey, a child's hand in each of hers, passing like a ghost through the celebration without being part of it. Something in her posture arrested him, the way she held herself with such quiet dignity, despite her obvious exclusion from the festivities, the unconscious grace of her movements, suggesting refinement despite her servant's dress. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds before she disappeared from view, ascending a staircase toward the upper floors, but Sebastian found himself inexplicably disturbed by the glimpse, by the contrast between her invisible passage and the glittering spectacle surrounding him. Later, when he mentioned the woman to his brother, Edward laughed and said, "Oh, that's Miss Hartley, the children's governess. Excellent with Catherine and James, practically invisible otherwise. My wife says she's never had a governess so competent, manages everything without fuss or complaint." The word invisible echoed in Sebastian's mind with unexpected force, carrying implications he couldn't quite name, but which left him strangely unsettled. Near midnight, duty demanded another waltz with Lady Pemberton's daughter, a suitable match his mother had suggested with increasing frequency, and as he guided her through the patterns of the dance, he found himself thinking instead of the woman in grey, wondering what circumstances had placed her in that corridor between worlds, wondering why the image of her quiet exclusion haunted him more than all the celebrated beauty currently in his arms. When the evening finally concluded and he retired to his chambers, Sebastian stood at his window looking out over snow-covered grounds, unable to shake the sense that something significant had occurred in those 3 seconds of observation, that he had glimpsed something true and substantial in a world increasingly composed of beautiful surfaces, concealing nothing at all. Days passed after the ball, the manor settling back into its winter rhythms as guests departed, and the extraordinary gave way to the ordinary, yet Sebastian found himself lingering at his brother's estate in a manner most uncharacteristic for a man who typically conducted his visits with clockwork precision before returning to his own ducal responsibilities. It was on the 4th morning of this extended stay, as dawn light filtered through frost-covered windows and the household still slept, that he found himself wandering the corridors restlessly, drawn by something he could neither name nor dismiss. He paused outside the music room, arrested by sound, the pianoforte being played with such exquisite skill that for a moment he forgot to breathe, the melody achingly beautiful, filled with a longing that spoke of things lost and remembered. He pushed open the door quietly to find her there, Miss Eleanor Hartley, seated at the instrument with her back to him, completely absorbed in the music, her fingers moving across the keys with the grace of long training and deep feeling, her whole being transformed from the careful governess he had glimpsed into someone luminous and alive. She was playing Chopin, he realized, one of the nocturnes, and there was such emotion in her interpretation that Sebastian stood transfixed, understanding in that moment that he was witnessing something private and true, something this woman kept hidden beneath her grey dresses and careful composure. The music stopped abruptly as she sensed his presence, her hands freezing above the keys, her posture instantly rigid with mortification as she turned to find the Duke of Thornwall standing in the doorway observing her. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly and dropping into a curtsy, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I apologize most sincerely. I did not realize I should not have presumed to use the family's instrument without permission." Her distress was genuine, her hands trembling slightly as she moved away from the pianoforte as though it might burn her, and Sebastian found himself disturbed by her assumption that creating such beauty could be inappropriate, that she had no right to touch an instrument she clearly understood far better than most. "Please," he said, entering the room with deliberate calm, "do not apologize for giving such pleasure. You play remarkably well, Miss Hartley. Where did you receive your training?" The question hung between them, laden with implications about her past, about the life she must have lived before circumstances reduced her to this invisible existence, and he watched emotions cross her face, pride, grief, careful control reasserting itself. My mother ensured I received instruction befitting my station, before circumstances altered that station considerably, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the color still high in her cheeks, her words chosen to convey information without inviting pity or further inquiry. Sebastian moved closer, intrigued by the tension between her obvious accomplishment and her determination to minimize it, by the sadness he could see beneath her composed exterior. "And do you dance as well as you play?" he asked, the question emerging before he quite knew he intended to ask it, watching her face for reaction. Something flickered in her eyes, memory, longing, loss, before her expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "I was taught the accomplishments expected of a gentleman's daughter, Your Grace, but those days are long past and such activities are not appropriate to my current position," she said, and her formality was like a wall being constructed between them, brick by careful brick. "I must return to my pupils. They will be waking soon and requiring their breakfast." She moved toward the door, toward escape, and Sebastian found himself stepping aside while simultaneously wanting to block her path, to demand she return to the pianoforte and play until that careful mask cracked and revealed the woman beneath it. "Miss Hartley," he said as she passed, causing her to pause and look up at him with those clear grey eyes that held such depth. "Thank you for the music. It was the most honest thing I have encountered in some time." She seemed startled by the comment, uncertain how to respond to praise from a duke or to the intensity she surely read in his expression, and after a moment she merely nodded and slipped from the room, leaving Sebastian standing alone among the morning shadows, realizing with sudden clarity that he was intrigued in a way he had not been in years, that this woman, with her hidden depths and careful invisibility, had somehow become the most compelling mystery he had ever encountered. Over the following days, Sebastian found himself manufacturing reasons to remain at Ashworth Manor, with a creativity that would have amused him had he been capable of observing his own behavior with any objectivity. He claimed estate business required his consultation, told his brother he was considering investments in the region, suggested his presence might be helpful with various matters that had managed perfectly well without ducal intervention for years, and Edward accepted these transparent excuses with knowing smiles that Sebastian chose to ignore. The truth, which he acknowledged only in the privacy of his own thoughts, was that he could not bring himself to leave while the mystery of Eleanor Hartley remained unsolved, while the contrast between the woman he had glimpsed at the pianoforte and the careful governess who moved through the household like a shadow continued to occupy his mind with increasing frequency. He began to observe her with the children, positioning himself in corridors where he might witness her interactions with young Catherine and James, and what he saw disturbed the foundations of assumptions he had never before questioned. She possessed extraordinary patience, explaining difficult concepts with a clarity that suggested genuine intelligence rather than rote instruction. Her voice warm with affection as she guided the children through their lessons in mathematics, literature, history, treating their questions with respect that many adults would not extend to those so young. He watched her teach Catherine a simple melody on the pianoforte, her hands guiding the child's fingers with such gentleness, her praise genuine when the girl finally mastered a difficult passage, and Sebastian found himself moved by the sight in ways he could not quite articulate. On a particularly bright afternoon, he observed from the library window as Eleanor walked with the children through the snow-covered gardens, their laughter carrying on the cold air as she pointed out winter birds and explained their habits. Her own face transformed by joy that seemed to come not from her own happiness but from theirs, as though she had learned to find pleasure only in service to others. He began engineering what he told himself were accidental encounters, appearing in the library when he knew she selected books for her pupils, finding reasons to pass through corridors at times when she might be moving between the schoolroom and the children's chambers. Each brief interaction reinforcing his growing fascination, even as she maintained proper distance with an expertise born of years practicing invisibility. She never presumed, never lingered, never allowed conversations to stray beyond the most formal courtesies, and yet Sebastian could sense something beneath that careful composure. He could see in her eyes a depth of feeling and intelligence that she worked constantly to conceal. His brother noticed his unusual extended stay, remarking over dinner one evening that Sebastian had not remained at the manor for more than a week in 5 years, and the teasing observation carried implications that Sebastian deflected with practiced skill, even as he recognized their truth. He was staying because of her, because Eleanor Hartley, with her hidden depths and quiet strength, had become the most compelling person he had encountered in a life surrounded by celebrated beauties and accomplished ladies, because beneath her grey dresses and careful invisibility, he sensed something substantial and real in a world increasingly composed of beautiful surfaces, and he realized with a sensation like falling that he had never met anyone quite like her, that she had somehow become essential to him in the space of mere days. And the discovery both exhilarated and terrified him in equal measure. Eleanor had learned long ago to exist in the narrow spaces between visibility and complete erasure, to perform her duties with competence while drawing no attention to herself, to find what satisfaction she could in the children's progress and the occasional quiet hour with a book. Yet the Duke's continued presence at Ashworth Manor had begun to unsettle the careful equilibrium she had maintained for 6 years. She found herself aware of him in ways that terrified her, her body tensing when he entered a room, her heart quickening at the sound of his voice in distant corridors, and she hated this weakness in herself, this foolish response to a man so far above her station that entertaining even the smallest hope constituted madness. In the darkness of her small room at night, she allowed herself to remember what she had been before catastrophe reshaped her existence, before her father's death from fever had revealed debts no one suspected, and left her mother and younger sister with nothing but the charity of reluctant relatives. She had been Eleanor Hartley of Hartley House, a modest estate in Derbyshire, the elder daughter of a gentleman who had loved music and books and had ensured his daughters received education befitting their station, and she had danced at assemblies in the local town, had played pianoforte for guests. She had believed with the careless confidence of youth that her future would include love and partnership and all the ordinary joys expected by a gentleman's daughter. That girl seemed like someone from another lifetime, a stranger whose naive optimism Eleanor could barely recognize, for at 20 she had taken her first position as governess to save her mother and sister from complete destitution, had learned to make herself invisible, to want nothing, to expect nothing beyond the security of employment and a roof over her head. She watched Sebastian with the children now, observed his unexpected gentleness as he allowed young James to show him a collection of interesting stones, his patience as Catherine demonstrated her improving skill at the pianoforte, and something in her chest ached with a longing she could not afford to acknowledge, for she recognized in these moments a kindness that had nothing to do with rank or obligation, a genuine warmth that made her understand why her carefully constructed defenses felt increasingly fragile. She knew she should avoid him entirely, should request different hours for the children's outdoor activities, should ensure their paths never crossed, yet she found herself incapable of this sensible course, drawn to him despite every warning her rational mind provided, and after each encounter she would retreat to her room and remind herself with brutal honesty of social realities, and would recite like a catechism the impossibility of what she barely dared acknowledge she desired. When he smiled at something, she said, when he treated her opinions as though they mattered, when his eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that suggested he truly saw her, Eleanor felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack, and the possibility of hope emerging through those cracks frightened her more than any hardship she had yet endured, for she understood that hoping, believing, allowing herself to imagine possibilities beyond her station would only make the inevitable return to reality more devastating. She determined with renewed conviction to maintain her invisibility, to protect both her position and her heart, to survive this strange interlude by remembering that dukes did not fall in love with governesses except in foolish novels, and that she had long ago learned the difference between fantasy and the harsh truths that governed women's lives. Yet even as she made this resolution, she knew with a certainty that felt like prophecy that Sebastian Ashworth had already become dangerous to her in ways she might never fully overcome. Sebastian discovered Eleanor in the library on a grey afternoon, when sleet tapped against the tall windows and the fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound volumes, and she stood before the shelves with her back to the door, reaching for a book just beyond her grasp, her posture revealing an unself-conscious grace that disappeared the moment she became aware of observation. He watched her for a heartbeat before speaking, Noting how the firelight caught in her dark hair, where it was pulled back in that severe style all governesses seemed required to adopt. And when he offered assistance in a voice carefully modulated to avoid startling her, she turned with that same swift composure he had come to recognize, the brief flash of something unguarded in her eyes, vanishing before he could properly identify it, as she curtsied with perfect formality and explained she was selecting texts for Catherine's literature lessons. The conversation began with the careful distance she always maintained, her responses proper and brief, as he retrieved the volume she had sought and handed it to her. Yet Sebastian found himself unwilling to let her retreat so quickly, found himself asking what she thought of the book, whether she enjoyed Wordsworth's poetry, and he saw her hesitation, that moment of internal calculation, where she clearly debated the wisdom of engaging in conversation that exceeded the bounds of necessity. Something in her expression must have shifted toward acceptance, for she offered a thoughtful response that revealed genuine literary knowledge, her voice losing some of its careful neutrality as she discussed the poet's treatment of nature and memory. And Sebastian seized upon this opening to continue the discussion, asking her opinions on other works, treating her thoughts as he would those of any educated person, rather than someone employed in his brother's household. Eleanor clearly remained conscious of propriety, yet he could sense her hunger for intellectual discourse, could see how she struggled between the pleasure of genuine conversation and her awareness that this intimacy exceeded what was appropriate, and gradually, carefully, he drew her deeper into discussion that ranged from poetry to philosophy, to observations about the world that revealed the breadth of her education and the quality of her mind. He shared his own thoughts with an honesty that surprised him, speaking of the loneliness inherent in his position, the weight of ducal responsibilities that left little room for authentic human connection, the sensation of being surrounded by people who saw only his title rather than the man who bore it, and he watched something shift in her face as he spoke, watched wariness give way to unexpected sympathy, as though she recognized in his gilded isolation something akin to her own invisibility. The library grew darker as afternoon faded toward evening, the fire burning low as they stood near the shelves, speaking with an ease that felt both natural and dangerous, and Sebastian understood they had crossed some invisible threshold, had moved beyond the formal boundaries that should govern interactions between a duke and a governess. Yet he could not bring himself to regret this transgression when Eleanor's intelligence and depth called to something in him that had been starved for precisely this kind of genuine exchange. He saw the moment she remembered herself, remembered what they were to each other in the eyes of the world, watched her withdraw behind careful formality, even as she remained physically present, and when she murmured something about the hour growing late and the children requiring her attention, when she gathered her books and curtsied and moved toward the door with that practiced invisibility, Sebastian remained among the shelves, feeling as though something significant had shifted in the architecture of his understanding, knowing with absolute certainty that he wanted to know her, truly know her, wanted to understand the woman behind the governess's careful facade, and he recognized with the clarity of revelation that he would pursue this knowledge regardless of convention or consequence, for Eleanor Hartley had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Weeks passed as winter deepened its hold on the countryside, frost etching intricate patterns on window panes and snow transforming Ashworth Manor's grounds into landscapes of pristine silence, and Sebastian found himself extending his stay indefinitely with excuses that grew progressively thinner until he simply stopped offering explanations to his increasingly amused brother, who observed this unprecedented deviation from ducal routine with raised eyebrows and knowing smiles that Sebastian chose to ignore. A pattern developed between Eleanor and himself, delicate as spun glass yet surprisingly resilient, built from accumulated moments that individually seemed insignificant, yet together formed the architecture of something neither dared name, and he found himself engineering opportunities for conversation with a determination that would have astonished anyone who knew his usual indifference to social connection. He brought her books from his own collection, volumes of poetry and philosophy he thought might interest her, and watched her face transform when he asked her opinions, as though they truly mattered, as though she were not merely a governess but an intellectual equal whose thoughts deserved consideration. And gradually, cautiously, she began to open like a flower coaxed toward reluctant blooming, revealing intelligence and wit and depths of understanding that confirmed everything he had suspected about the substantial woman concealed beneath the governess's careful invisibility. Their conversations ranged across literature and music and observations about the world that left Sebastian feeling more intellectually alive than he had in years. And he discovered in Eleanor not only knowledge but genuine wisdom born from hardship and observation, a perspective on life that challenged his assumptions and made him reconsider truths he had always accepted without question. They developed a wordless understanding that allowed communication in glances across rooms where others gathered, could convey volumes in the slight tilt of a head or the briefest meeting of eyes, and Sebastian found himself attuned to her presence with an awareness that bordered on the uncanny, always knowing when she entered a space, always conscious of where she stood and what small expressions crossed her carefully controlled features. He watched her with the children and saw how she balanced discipline with genuine affection, how she nurtured their curiosity while maintaining necessary boundaries, and when young Catherine threw her arms around Eleanor's waist in spontaneous gratitude for some kindness, he saw how Eleanor's face softened with love she could not entirely suppress, and something in his chest constricted with emotion he recognized as dangerous, for he understood he was falling in love with her in ways that transcended physical attraction or intellectual compatibility, falling in love with her essential goodness and quiet strength, and the courage required to maintain dignity in circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Yet even as their bond deepened, he remained acutely aware of Eleanor's growing anxiety, could see how she struggled between the pleasure she took in their exchanges and her fear of consequences, could sense her pulling back even as she leaned forward, and he knew the servants had begun to notice his attention and had seen the meaningful glances exchanged between maids and footmen when he requested Eleanor's presence or spent extended periods in whatever room she occupied. Eleanor grew increasingly pale as whispers multiplied through the household, her movements becoming more rigid with each passing day, as though she were trying through sheer force of will to restore the invisibility that had once protected her. And Sebastian understood with mounting frustration that the world was closing in around them, that the fragile space they had created could not withstand indefinitely the pressures of social reality, yet he found himself unable to surrender what had become essential to his happiness, unable to imagine returning to the hollow existence he had known before. Eleanor Hartley had taught him the difference between mere living and truly being alive. Lady Ashworth summoned Eleanor to the morning room on a Tuesday afternoon, when pale sunlight filtered through lace curtains and the scent of hothouse flowers filled air that suddenly felt suffocating, and Eleanor entered with the practiced composure that had become her armor against the world. Curtsying to the woman who had always treated her with distant but not unkind correctness, yet something in Lady Ashworth's expression made Eleanor's heart constrict with premonition even before the older woman began to speak. The conversation started gently enough, inquiries about the children's progress and Catherine's improving French pronunciation, but Eleanor could sense the true purpose lurking beneath these pleasantries, like rocks beneath deceptively smooth water. And when Lady Ashworth finally approached the actual subject with careful delicacy, speaking of how she had noticed the Duke's unprecedented extended stay and his unusual attention to certain members of the household, Eleanor felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet, even as she maintained outward stillness. Lady Ashworth spoke kindly, genuinely kindly, with none of the cruelty that might have made the words easier to dismiss as mere spite, explaining that she understood how a young woman in Eleanor's position might misinterpret the interest of a gentleman so far above her station, how natural it would be to harbor hopes that could only lead to heartbreak and ruin, and each word landed like a stone against Eleanor's chest, because she recognized the truth in them, even as she wished desperately to deny their validity. The mistress of Ashworth Manor reminded Eleanor of the vast gulf that separated a governess from a duke, spoke of the impossibility of such boundaries ever being crossed, regardless of whatever genuine regard might exist, and emphasized with gentle but inexorable firmness that Eleanor must understand her position, must protect her reputation and future prospects by maintaining appropriate distance, must not allow herself to believe in possibilities that the world would never permit. Eleanor listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face carefully blank, absorbing each word like blows she could not deflect, and when Lady Ashworth finished by assuring her that she meant only kindness, only wished to spare Eleanor the pain of impossible dreams, Eleanor thanked her with a voice that sounded remarkably steady considering the devastation occurring behind her ribs, and left the morning room feeling as though she had been sentenced to some terrible punishment for crimes she had not quite committed, but had certainly contemplated. She began avoiding Sebastian, with determination that bordered on desperation, retreating into rigid formality whenever circumstances forced interaction, responding to his attempts at conversation with monosyllabic propriety that allowed no opening for the intimacy they had cultivated, and she saw confusion dawn in his eyes, saw hurt flash across features that had become dear to her in ways she could no longer afford to acknowledge. He found her in the garden 3 days later, where she supervised the children's outdoor lessons, and when he approached with that particular expression she had learned meant he intended genuine conversation, she felt panic rise in her throat and forced herself to meet his gaze with coldness. She did not feel, telling him with careful precision that their previous conversations had been inappropriate and must cease, and that she had duties to attend to, and he surely had obligations elsewhere. And when he stepped closer, confusion giving way to frustration as he demanded to know what had changed, why she was shutting him out with such finality. Helena felt something break inside her chest, even as she maintained the glacial distance that Lady Ashworth's words had taught her was her only protection, her only hope of preserving whatever dignity and employment she still possessed in a world that would never forgive the presumption of loving above her station. Sebastian refused to accept her withdrawal with the same determination that had built his position in society, and he followed Eleanor as she attempted to retreat toward the manor with the children trailing behind in confused silence, catching her arm with a gentleness that belied the intensity in his voice when he said her name, not Miss Hartley but Eleanor, spoken with such raw emotion that she stopped despite every instinct, screaming at her to flee. And when she finally turned to face him with eyes that glistened with unshed tears, he demanded again to know what had changed, why she was erecting these walls between them after weeks of genuine connection. And Eleanor felt something crack in the careful composure she had maintained since Lady Ashworth's devastating kindness. The words came tumbling out before she could stop them, pushed to honesty by the intensity of his gaze and the unbearable weight of carrying this truth alone. And she heard herself saying with a trembling voice that threatened to break entirely, "You are a duke, your grace, and I am a governess." And the formal address felt like ash on her tongue after weeks of more intimate conversation, but she forced herself to continue, to articulate the impossibility that should have been obvious to him from the beginning, the vast gulf that separated their positions in ways that could never be bridged regardless of whatever regard might exist between them. She saw him begin to protest and raised her hand to stop him, finding courage in desperation to speak truths that burned her throat with their bitterness, explaining that his attention, however genuinely kind, and however much it meant to her in ways she could not fully express, placed her in terrible danger, threatened her reputation and her position and her entire future in ways he could not possibly understand from his place of privilege and power. Eleanor's voice gained strength as she spoke, articulating fears she had carried in silence for weeks, telling him that the servants had noticed his interest, that whispers had begun to multiply through the household like poison spreading through water, that Lady Ashworth herself had spoken to her about maintaining appropriate distance and protecting herself from impossible hopes, and with each word she watched Sebastian's expression shift from frustration to dawning comprehension, saw him begin to understand barriers she faced that his privilege had rendered invisible to him. He tried to reassure her, reaching for her hand with that gentleness that had become so familiar, promising that he would never allow harm to come to her, that his regard was genuine and his intentions honorable, but Eleanor pulled away from his touch as though it burned, knowing that his reassurances, however sincerely meant, could not protect her from the reality of their circumstances, could not change the fundamental truth that he would eventually leave Ashworth Manor to return to his duties and his world, while she remained here, subject to judgment and whispers, and the slow destruction of a reputation that was her only valuable possession in a world that granted women in her position so little. She looked at him with eyes that held all the longing and grief she could no longer fully suppress, and said with quiet devastation that cut deeper than any anger could have, "You will leave eventually, Your Grace, because dukes always do, and I will remain here, living with the consequences of these weeks, of your kindness, of allowing myself to believe for even a moment that the impossible might somehow become possible. And then, gathering the fragments of her dignity around herself like armor. She asked him with simple directness that bordered on pleading to please stop being kind to her, because his kindness hurt more than cruelty ever could, because every conversation and every shared glance and every moment of genuine connection only made the inevitable ending more unbearable, and she could not survive much more of this exquisite torture of loving someone she could never truly have. Sebastian stood frozen as she turned away, the children's small hands finding hers as she guided them back toward the manor with steps that remained steady through sheer force of will, and Eleanor did not allow herself to look back at him standing alone in the garden where winter-bare roses waited for spring that might never come, because she knew if she met his eyes again, her fragile control would shatter entirely, and she had so little left to lose that she must protect what remained with every weapon at her disposal, even if that weapon was distance from the only man who had ever made her feel truly seen, truly valued, truly alive in ways she had forgotten were possible for someone consigned to the shadows of other people's houses and other people's lives. Sebastian stood in his chambers that evening as darkness gathered beyond the windows and firelight cast restless shadows across walls that seemed to close around him like the social structures Eleanor had articulated with such devastating clarity, and for the first time in his adult life, he found himself confronting the comfortable privilege he had always taken for granted, the invisible power that had shaped every interaction and opportunity without his ever questioning its fundamental justice or recognizing how it created barriers for those without such advantages. He had been naive, he realized with growing shame, assuming that his regard for Eleanor could exist in some protected space separate from the realities of class and position, never considering how his attention might endanger her precisely because he stood so far above her in society's cruel hierarchy, and the recognition of his thoughtlessness sat heavy in his chest, like stones accumulating weight with each breath. Sleep eluded him as he paced the length of his room, wrestling with an internal battle that grew more complex with each passing hour, torn between the growing love he could no longer deny and the terrible unfairness of pursuing a woman whose position made her vulnerable to consequences he would never face, whose reputation could be destroyed by the very attention that cost him nothing beyond family disapproval that his wealth and title would eventually overcome. He considered leaving Ashworth Manor, removing himself from Eleanor's life to spare her the difficulty his presence created, yet the thought of never seeing her again, of abandoning whatever existed between them without fighting for its possibility, felt like a kind of death he could not quite bring himself to accept, even as he recognized it might be the kindest course. His brother found him in the library before dawn, disheveled and hollow-eyed from a sleepless night, and Edward Ashworth took one look at Sebastian's face before pouring 2 glasses of brandy and settling into the chair opposite, with the patient expression of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary for truth to emerge. The conversation began haltingly, Sebastian unused to discussing matters of the heart even with family, but Edward's steady presence and genuine concern gradually loosened his tongue, and he found himself admitting what he had scarcely acknowledged to himself in clear terms, that he had fallen in love with Eleanor Hartley, that her intelligence and grace and quiet strength had captured him in ways no society beauty ever had, that the thought of a future without her felt impossibly bleak, despite having known her for mere weeks. Edward's shock was visible but not unkind, his silence stretching long enough for Sebastian to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake in confessing such an impossible attachment. But when his brother finally spoke, it was to ask with simple directness what Sebastian intended to do, whether this was passing infatuation or something substantial enough to justify the social upheaval such a choice would inevitably create. Sebastian recognized the question for what it was, a challenge to examine his own commitment before taking actions that would affect not only his life but Eleanor's and potentially his entire family's standing, and he sat with the weight of that question pressing against his conscience until he understood with sudden clarity that he could not simply walk away as though these weeks had meant nothing. He could not abandon Eleanor to face the consequences of his attention alone, yet also could not continue as before, caught in this terrible limbo that placed her in constant danger while resolving nothing. He made his decision in that moment before dawn, as the first pale light began to infiltrate the library's darkness, a choice that would require tremendous courage from both of them, but offered the only path forward that honored the depth of what he felt and the respect he owed to the woman who had shown him dimensions of connection he had never imagined possible, and though he could not yet see clearly how to navigate the obstacles that stood between this moment and any hope of a future together, he knew with absolute certainty that he would find a way or spend the rest of his life regretting his cowardice in the face of society's arbitrary cruelties. As February arrived with unexpected warmth that seemed to mock the frost that had settled in Eleanor's heart, Sebastian formulated a plan born of equal parts frustration and determination, a scheme that emerged from sleepless nights spent contemplating the impossible distance between what society dictated and what his soul demanded, and his thoughts turned repeatedly to the manor's grand ballroom that had stood empty and locked since the Christmas festivities, its polished floors and glittering chandeliers hidden behind heavy doors that required a key kept in the housekeeper's possession. He obtained that key through means he did not examine too closely, claiming need to inspect the room for planned renovations, and spent an entire afternoon preparing the space with meticulous care, lighting hundreds of candles in every sconce and candelabra until the ballroom glowed like something from a fairy story, the flames casting dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed countless elegant gatherings, but never one quite like what he envisioned for this night. Sebastian sent word to Eleanor through a brief note, delivered by a footman he trusted for discretion, requesting her presence in the ballroom at midnight, with no explanation beyond his signature, and he spent the hours before the appointed time pacing his chambers and questioning his own audacity, while simultaneously knowing he could not continue in this limbo of unresolved feeling and social impossibility. Eleanor discovered the note tucked beneath her door as she prepared for bed, the children already sleeping in the nursery adjacent to her modest room, and she held the cream-colored paper in trembling fingers while conducting an internal debate that raged between propriety and longing, between the safety of refusal and the dangerous pull of wanting to see him one final time, to hear whatever he felt compelled to say in such dramatic fashion. She knew she should not go, that every rule of proper conduct and self-preservation demanded she remain in her quarters and send polite declination in the morning. Yet she found herself dressing carefully in her best gown, still simple and governess-appropriate, but the finest she possessed, and telling herself she would attend only to hear what he wished to say and then end this impossible attachment properly, with clear words that would leave no room for misunderstanding or false hope. As midnight approached, Eleanor made her way through darkened corridors, with heart pounding so forcefully she feared it might wake the entire sleeping household, and when she reached the ballroom she found the door unlocked as promised, the faint glow of candlelight visible through the gap beneath the heavy wood. She pushed the door open with hands that shook despite her attempt at composure, and stepped into a vision that stole her breath entirely, hundreds of candles, transforming the familiar ballroom into something magical and otherworldly, their light reflecting off mirrors and gilded frames until the entire space seemed to shimmer with golden radiance. And there in the center of it all stood Sebastian in full formal attire, in his evening clothes immaculate, and his expression filled with such intensity that Eleanor felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble before either of them had spoken a single word. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway for several heartbeats, as her mind struggled to comprehend the transformation Sebastian had wrought upon this familiar space. The ballroom where she had watched from shadows during the Christmas festivities now reimagined as something intimate and impossibly romantic, and she felt her carefully prepared speeches dissolve like morning mist beneath the intensity of his gaze, as he moved toward her with movements that held both confidence and something that looked remarkably like vulnerability. He stopped several feet away, maintaining a distance that felt both respectful and charged with unspoken possibility, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the candlelit expanse with quiet determination that sent shivers along her spine. Despite her attempts to maintain composure and remember all the reasons this midnight meeting represented terrible judgment and dangerous impropriety. "You told me you never dance," Sebastian said, and the simplicity of the statement somehow contained layers of meaning that Eleanor could not quite pass through the chaos of her emotions, and I wanted to know why someone who moves through the world with such natural grace would deny herself something that clearly once brought joy. What circumstances or sorrows led you to abandon something that should be as natural as breathing for a woman of your obvious refinement and education? Eleanor tried to summon the cool formality that had served as her protection for so many years, attempted to retreat behind the barriers of class and propriety that had kept her safe if desperately lonely, but something in the way Sebastian looked at her in this transformed ballroom made those defenses feel suddenly flimsy and inadequate against the force of what existed between them, whether she acknowledged it or not. "Your Grace, this is most improper," she managed, though her voice emerged less steady than she intended, betraying the way her heart hammered against her ribs with mingled fear and longing. "I should not have come, and you should not have arranged such a meeting without consideration for how it might appear should anyone discover." But Sebastian interrupted her protest with a gesture that was gentle yet somehow final, a raising of his hand that asked for her attention rather than demanded it. "Tonight there are no servants, no witnesses, no society," he said, and she watched as he moved to the ballroom doors and produced a heavy iron key from his pocket, turning it in the lock with a decisive click that seemed to echo through the cavernous space and through Eleanor's consciousness with equal resonance. "There are no dukes or governesses, no rules about who may speak to whom or who deserves joy, and who must forever deny themselves even the smallest pleasures. There are simply two people, Eleanor, two souls who have found something rare and precious and terrifying, and I have locked these doors because I will not let you run away again before you tell me the truth about why you stopped dancing, why you stopped believing you deserve beauty and music and all the things that make life more than mere survival." Eleanor felt something crack inside her careful control as he spoke her Christian name with such tenderness, the intimacy of that simple address breaking through barriers she had constructed over years of teaching herself to be invisible, to want nothing, to accept that her circumstances had permanently removed her from the world of ballrooms and waltzes, and men who looked at her as Sebastian was looking at her now. "You cannot lock me in here," she protested, even as part of her soul sang at the romantic audacity of the gesture, even as she recognized that some desperate part of herself had hoped for exactly this kind of decisive action that removed choice and responsibility and left her no option but to face the feelings she had been running from since the moment. Their eyes first met across a crowded corridor. "This is improper and dangerous, and you must see how impossible." But again, Sebastian interrupted, crossing the space between them with slow, deliberate steps that gave her ample opportunity to retreat if she truly wished, though her feet remained rooted to the polished floor, as though her body had declared mutiny against her mind's panicked commands. "I'm not asking the governess," Sebastian said quietly as he stopped directly before her, close enough that she could see the candlelight reflected in his eyes and smell the faint scent of sandalwood and tobacco that clung to his evening clothes. "I'm asking Eleanor, the woman who plays Chopin with such feeling that it breaks my heart, who speaks 3 languages and quotes philosophy and sees the world with eyes that miss nothing, and the woman I have come to." And he stopped himself, seeming to reconsider his words before extending his hand toward her in invitation, his palm open and waiting for her decision. "Dance with me, Eleanor, just once, and tell me I'm imagining what exists between us. Convince me that I'm the only one who feels as though the world has shifted on its axis, and I will unlock those doors and never trouble you again." 3. Eleanor's resistance crumbled like ancient fortress walls beneath the weight of his extended hand and the naked hope in his eyes, and she found her fingers reaching toward his despite every rational thought, screaming warnings about propriety and consequences and the impossibility of what this midnight waltz represented in the broader context of their respective positions in society's rigid hierarchy. Her hand trembled visibly as it met his palm, and she felt the warmth of his skin through her thin gloves, felt the gentle but firm way his fingers closed around hers, as though he feared she might yet flee if given the slightest opportunity, and then his other hand found its proper place at her waist, while hers came to rest upon his shoulder with a hesitance that spoke of years away from ballrooms and the muscle memory of movements she had forced herself to forget. The first strains of music filled the candlelit space, a music box somewhere in the shadows, playing a waltz that seemed impossibly perfect for this impossible moment, and Sebastian began to lead her through the steps with a patience that suggested he understood she needed time to remember how her body should move, how to trust another person to guide her through space and rhythm and the intimate choreography of the dance. Eleanor remained stiff initially, her spine rigid with the combined force of propriety and fear, her steps mechanical and careful as she counted the rhythm in her head, the way her dance master had taught her a lifetime ago when she had been a girl who believed the world held endless possibilities rather than endless limitations, and she could feel Sebastian's eyes upon her face, even as she kept her own gaze fixed firmly on his shoulder, unable yet to meet the intensity she knew she would find if she looked directly at him. He guided her gently through the turns, his lead clear but never forceful, giving her space to find her footing while simultaneously providing the structure she needed to remember the patterns, and gradually, so gradually, she barely noticed the transition. Eleanor felt something within her begin to soften, to yield, to remember not just the steps of the waltz but the joy that had once accompanied such movements, before circumstances had taught her that joy was a luxury governesses could not afford. "Tell me about the girl you were before," Sebastian said quietly as they moved through the candlelit ballroom, his voice pitched low enough that it felt like a secret shared between only them, despite the vast space surrounding their joined forms. "Tell me about Eleanor Hartley before she learned to make herself invisible, before she decided that music and dancing and beautiful things were meant for others, but never for herself." She drew a shaky breath as his question pierced through defenses already weakened by the romance of this clandestine waltz, and found herself answering with fragments of memory she had not allowed herself to examine in years. She loved mornings in the music room, Eleanor heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking of that long-ago girl required reverence for someone who had died, though Eleanor herself still lived. She would practice piano for hours and dream of performing at grand salons where cultured people would appreciate Beethoven and Mozart, and she believed that education and refinement mattered more than wealth or title, that a person's worth lay in their character and accomplishments rather than the circumstances of their birth. Sebastian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist as she spoke, and she felt him draw her slightly closer, though still maintaining the proper distance that formal dancing required. And when she finally gathered courage to lift her gaze from his shoulder to his face, she found him watching her with such tenderness that it made her breath catch in her throat and her steps falter before his steady lead helped her recover the rhythm. "And what happened to that girl?" he asked, though Eleanor suspected he already knew the answer, that he simply wanted to hear her speak it aloud, and to give voice to losses that had been borne in silence for so long they had become part of her identity, as surely as her name or the color of her eyes. The music swelled around them as Eleanor allowed herself to remember, to feel, to dance with something approaching the freedom she had once taken for granted, and she realized with startling clarity that this waltz in a locked ballroom had become far more than a dance. It had become a question. Sebastian was posing without words, an invitation to trust him, not just with her steps but with her heart. With the carefully protected vulnerability, she had learned to hide behind competence and invisible efficiency, and the conviction that wanting anything beyond survival was dangerous foolishness that could only lead to greater pain. As they continued to move through the waltz, Eleanor felt the careful architecture of her defenses crumbling like sandcastles before an inexorable tide, and words she had never intended to speak aloud emerged from somewhere deep within her wounded soul, where she had buried all the dreams and desires that had proven too painful to acknowledge in the harsh light of her daily existence, as someone society deemed unworthy of such aspirations. "I stopped dancing because I stopped believing I deserved joy," she whispered, and the confession hung between them like something fragile and precious, a truth so raw that speaking it felt like exposing her very heart to his scrutiny, and she watched his expression transform as he absorbed the weight of what she had revealed, the years of self-denial and convinced unworthiness that had shaped her into someone who watched life from shadows rather than participating in its beauty. Sebastian's hand tightened at her waist as his other hand held hers with a tenderness that made tears prick behind her eyelids. And when he spoke, his voice carried such fierce certainty that it seemed to reach into the wounded places inside her and offer healing she had not known she desperately craved. "Then I will teach you to believe it again," he said, and the simple declaration contained within it a promise that felt more binding than any formal vow, and more substantial than the social contracts that governed their world. And Eleanor felt something shift fundamentally within her as she allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to accept such an offer, to let someone see her not as invisible machinery that kept households running, but as a woman worthy of devotion and romance, and all the beautiful impossibilities she had trained herself to renounce. The dance became more intimate as they moved together through candlelight that painted shifting shadows across the polished floor, and Eleanor found herself drawn closer to Sebastian, as though some magnetic force operated between them that had nothing to do with conscious decision and everything to do with the recognition of kindred souls who had somehow found each another across the vast distances of class and circumstance and social expectation. She looked up into his face and saw reflected their emotions that matched the chaotic feelings churning in her own chest, and then Sebastian spoke words that shattered what remained of the careful world she had constructed around her vulnerable heart. "I love you, Eleanor," he said with such clarity and conviction that there could be no mistaking his meaning, no way to interpret his declaration as anything other than what it was: a man of tremendous power and position, confessing genuine love for a woman society would deem impossibly beneath him, and Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as the magnitude of his words struck her with the force of physical impact, all the longing she had suppressed for weeks, rising up to meet his confession with equal intensity, even as her rational mind screamed warnings about impossibility and inevitable heartbreak. "You cannot love me," she said through tears that she could not control, her voice breaking on the words even as her body continued to move with his through the final measures of the waltz. "The world will not allow it, Sebastian. They will destroy you for even contemplating such a connection, and I cannot bear to be the cause of your ruin or the subject of scandal that would follow us both for the remainder of our days." But Sebastian's expression held no uncertainty, no wavering in the face of her protests, and when he responded, his words carried the weight of decisions already made and bridges already burned in service of what he knew to be true, regardless of social consequences. "Then perhaps it's time to challenge what the world allows," he said as the music drew to its inevitable conclusion, and they stood together in the center of that transformed ballroom, with their hands still joined and their breathing heavy from exertion and emotion, the space between them charged with possibility and terror, and the recognition that they had reached a moment that would define the remainder of their lives, regardless of which path they chose. The final notes of the music box faded into silence that felt almost sacred in its intensity, and Sebastian looked at her with eyes that seemed to see directly into her soul as he asked the question that would require her to choose between the safety of invisible resignation and the terrifying courage of hope. "If there were no barriers, Eleanor," he said quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm where their hands remained joined. "If society did not exist with all its rules and restrictions and cruel hierarchies, if there were only you and I standing here in this moment, would you choose me?" Eleanor's carefully constructed dam of restraint and self-protection shattered completely under the weight of Sebastian's question, and she found herself speaking truths she had locked away so deeply that hearing them in her own voice felt like meeting a stranger who had lived inside her heart for all these years of careful invisibility and determined resignation to a life devoid of the very things that made existence feel worthwhile rather than merely endurable. "Yes," she whispered through tears that flowed freely now, without any attempt at containment or propriety. "I would choose you. I have chosen you already, though I fought desperately against it. I told myself 1,000 times that what I felt was foolishness or presumption or dangerous fantasy that would only deepen the wounds I had barely learned to carry with any semblance of grace." Her voice broke on the confession, but she continued, speaking as though years of silence demanded compensation in this moment of brutal honesty, and Sebastian's arms came around her with a tenderness that made her weep harder, even as she felt safer than she had in all the years since her father's death had torn away the comfortable world she had taken for granted in her youth. "I have loved you for weeks, Sebastian," she said against his chest where her face had come to rest, as though her body knew what her mind had refused to acknowledge about needing his strength to support her through this emotional tempest. "Loved you and hated myself for the weakness of it, for allowing hope to take root in soil. I had salted against exactly such dangerous growth because I knew that hoping for impossible things only makes the inevitable return to reality more devastating than if one had never dared to dream at all." Sebastian's hand cradled the back of her head, while his other arm held her close, and she felt him press a kiss to her hair as she continued pouring out the grief and longing and terror that had accumulated behind her careful masks of competence and invisibility. "I am so afraid," Eleanor confessed in a voice barely audible, even in the profound silence of that locked ballroom, where candlelight still flickered across walls that had witnessed her transformation from governess, who dared not hope, into woman who could no longer contain the fullness of her heart. "Afraid of believing that this could be real, that you truly see me as worthy of such devotion, afraid that I will wake tomorrow and find this was merely a beautiful dream, my starving soul conjured to torment me with visions of everything I can never have." She felt Sebastian draw back just enough to tilt her face upward, with gentle fingers beneath her chin, and when she met his eyes, she saw such fierce determination there that it momentarily stilled the chaos of her fears. "I will find a way, Eleanor," he said with the absolute certainty of a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, though she sensed this vow carried different weight than any promise he had made before, because it concerned not business or property or political maneuvering, but the tender and terrifying business of two hearts reaching across impossible distances to find each other, despite everything society had constructed to keep them apart. "Trust me. Trust that what we have found together is worth fighting for, and worth challenging every convention and facing every consequence, because I will not let you go back to believing you deserve anything less than complete joy and love and all the beautiful impossibilities you trained yourself to renounce." Eleanor wavered between hope and fear as she stood within the circle of his arms, wanting desperately to believe his promises, while simultaneously knowing that the world beyond this locked ballroom would not simply yield because two people loved each other across boundaries meant to be inviolable. And they remained there talking as candlelight gradually dimmed, and the first hints of dawn began to pale the darkness beyond the tall windows, speaking of dreams and fears, and the terrifying courage it would require from both of them to forge a path that did not yet exist in their carefully ordered world. When Sebastian finally unlocked the door as early morning light transformed the ballroom from romantic sanctuary into merely another grand room in a great house, they separated with the new understanding that everything had irrevocably changed between them, though Eleanor still carried doubt deep in her heart about whether love, however genuine, could truly overcome the vast machinery of social expectation and class division that had governed their world for centuries before they were born, and would continue long after they were gone. Despite all the precautions they had taken in that midnight meeting, the locked ballroom could not truly remain a secret in a household where servants moved through corridors like invisible witnesses to every transgression against propriety, and by the time Eleanor descended to the breakfast room 2 mornings after that transformative night, she could feel the weight of judgment in every sidelong glance and hastily silenced conversation that followed her movements through Ashworth Manor's elegant spaces. The head housekeeper, a woman who had always treated Eleanor with distant respect, appropriate to her position, now regarded her with barely concealed disapproval as she passed in the hallway, and when Eleanor entered the schoolroom she found that someone had already laid out the children's lessons with a pointed efficiency that suggested her presence was no longer required for even the small administrative duties she had always handled herself. She tried to maintain her composure through the morning's instruction, but her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages of the geography primer, and when Lady Ashworth's maid appeared at the schoolroom door with a summons to her ladyship's private sitting room, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed world begin its inevitable collapse around her, with the grinding finality of ancient stone walls crumbling under their own impossible weight. Lady Ashworth received her with a coldness that made their previous kind warning seem warm by comparison, and she wasted no time in articulating exactly what servants had observed and what conclusions the entire household had drawn from the missing ballroom key, the candles that had burned through the night, and Eleanor's absence from her quarters until dawn, while the Duke had also been mysteriously unavailable during those same hours. "I had thought better of you, Miss Hartley," Lady Ashworth said with the particular cruelty of someone who believed themselves to be acting in service of moral order, "but it appears you have taken shameless advantage of His Grace's temporary and misguided interest to compromise both your position and his reputation in ways that cannot be overlooked or forgiven, regardless of whatever promises he may have made in moments of weakness." Eleanor stood before her employer's wife, with her spine straight and her hands folded calmly before her, though her heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she thought, surely it must be audible in that tastefully appointed room. And she said nothing in her own defense, because what defense could she offer against truths that were essentially accurate, even if the motivations attributed to her were monstrously unjust? And when Lady Ashworth informed her that her services would no longer be required at Ashworth Manor, and that she had precisely 3 days to collect her belongings and remove herself from the premises, Eleanor accepted the dismissal with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire tenure as governess, though she felt something dying inside her with each word of condemnation. She returned to her small quarters and began the mechanical process of packing her few possessions into the battered trunk that had accompanied her through 6 years of service, and with trembling hands she composed a brief note to Sebastian that released him from any obligation or promise made in that candlelit ballroom, because she would not allow him to sacrifice his position and his family's respect for a connection that society would never accept, and that would only bring him pain and scandal in proportion to whatever temporary happiness they might grasp in defiance of immutable social law. When Sebastian learned of her dismissal and impending departure through his brother's uncomfortable confession that same afternoon, in his fury at the injustice and cruelty of a system that would destroy a woman of Eleanor's intelligence and worth, simply for daring to be loved by someone above her, Station transformed into a cold determination that his family had never witnessed before, and he faced the choice that would define not only his future, but his understanding of what kind of man he wished to be, in a world that demanded he choose between love and duty, between his heart's truth and society's expectations, between protecting Eleanor and protecting the comfortable fiction that class barriers existed to serve justice rather than merely to preserve privilege for those already born to power. Sebastian's decision crystallized with the absolute clarity that comes when a man finally stops negotiating with his conscience and commits fully to the course his heart has known all along was inevitable, and within hours of reading Eleanor's note, releasing him from obligation, a gesture that only deepened his respect for her integrity and strengthened his resolve, he summoned his brother and sister-in-law to the drawing-room and informed them with the controlled formality of ducal authority that he intended to publicly court Miss Eleanor Hartley with the express purpose of making her his duchess, and the shocked silence that followed his announcement told him everything he needed to know about the magnitude of what he was proposing to challenge in their carefully ordered world. Lady Ashworth recovered first with sputtering objections about scandal and propriety, and what society would say, while his brother, clearly torn between fraternal loyalty and concern for family reputation, attempted more measured arguments about the difficulties Sebastian would face. The doors that would close to him, the whispers that would follow them both through every drawing-room in England, but Sebastian met each objection with calm certainty that acknowledged the costs while refusing to be swayed by them, because he had spent too many years living according to duty and expectation, without ever feeling the kind of profound connection he had discovered in Eleanor's company. The news spread through Ashworth Manor with the speed of wildfire through dry timber, and by evening the entire household knew that the Duke of Ashworth had declared his intention to marry the governess, an announcement so unprecedented that even the most jaded servants found themselves gathering in corners to discuss this upheaval of everything they had believed, fixed and immutable about the social order that governed their world. Sebastian's mother arrived from London within 2 days, her fury at what she perceived as her son's catastrophic lapse in judgment evident in every line of her imperious bearing as she swept into the manor, demanding immediate audience with Sebastian to talk sense into him before he destroyed everything 3 generations of Ashworth dukes had built through careful marriages and proper alliances. He received her in the library where he had first begun to truly know Eleanor, and he listened with patient respect as his mother articulated every argument against the match: Eleanor's lack of fortune, her inferior connections, the scandal it would create, the mockery he would face from his peers, the damage to their family's standing, and when she finished, he spoke with a quiet intensity that transformed the room's atmosphere, from confrontation to something approaching revelation. "Mother," he said, standing before the woman who had raised him to value duty above all else, "I have spent 32 years being everything a duke should be: responsible, proper, strategic in every alliance, and careful to never transgress the boundaries society has drawn for men of my station. And in all those years of perfect behavior, I have never once felt what I feel when Eleanor Hartley looks at me as though I am not a title or a fortune, but simply a man worthy of her respect and affection." His mother tried to interrupt, but he continued speaking with the authority of someone who had finally discovered what mattered more than approval or convention, articulating Eleanor's intelligence, her strength of character, her grace under circumstances that would have broken lesser souls, her capacity for depth and genuine feeling in a world where most interactions were mere performance of expected roles. He made clear that he understood the opposition he would face, the social consequences both for himself and for Eleanor, but he had weighed those costs against the prospect of living the rest of his life without the woman who had taught him that genuine connection was worth any sacrifice. And he found he would not choose the easier path of conformity, when doing so would mean betraying the most authentic part of himself he had ever discovered. When his mother realized that no argument would sway him, that he had made his decision with full awareness of what it would cost, her fury gradually transformed into something approaching grudging respect, mixed with maternal concern, and though she could not bring herself to offer her blessing, she ceased her active opposition and left him to face the consequences of his choice with the dignity befitting a duke, even if she believed him to be a fool. Sebastian went directly from that confrontation to Eleanor's small quarters, where she was completing her packing with hands that trembled slightly as she folded her few dresses into her worn trunk, and when she turned to find him standing in her doorway, she looked so fragile and beautiful and terrified that he crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands in his, before she could retreat behind her customary walls of propriety. "I'm asking you to be brave with me, Eleanor," he said with his heart laid bare in his eyes for her to see. And then he knelt before her in that modest room so different from the grand ballroom where they had danced, and he asked her properly to be his wife and to face with him whatever storms their choice would bring, to build a life together that defied every convention that said such connection was impossible between a duke and a governess. And he waited while she stood frozen between hope and terror, knowing that her answer would require from her a courage, perhaps greater than his own, because she had so much more to lose and so many more years of believing herself unworthy of exactly such impossible happiness. Eleanor stood in that small governess's room with Sebastian kneeling before her, like something from the romantic novels she had once read as a girl, before life taught her that such gestures belonged only to the realm of fiction and fantasy, and the war that raged within her heart in that suspended moment was between the woman she had been forced to become through 6 years of careful invisibility and the girl she had once been who believed that love and happiness were birthright rather than privileges reserved for those born to the proper stations and circumstances. She looked down at Sebastian's upturned face with his heart so evident in his eyes that it terrified her more than Lady Ashworth's condemnation or society's certain disapproval, and she felt herself standing at a precipice where one choice led back to the safe, familiar territory of lowered expectations and careful self-protection, while the other required a leap of faith so terrifying that every instinct screamed against the danger of falling and shattering upon the rocks of inevitable rejection and social destruction that surely awaited anyone foolish enough to reach for happiness so far above their designated sphere. A memory surfaced unbidden from her childhood herself, at 16 in her father's modest estate, spinning in the garden with her arms outstretched to catch the spring sunlight, believing with the absolute certainty of youth that the world was full of possibilities and that love, when it came, would be glorious and transforming, and hers by right rather than by impossible fortune. And she recognized with sudden clarity that the years between that dancing girl and this frightened woman had been spent systematically killing that belief, burying it under layers of protective resignation until she had almost forgotten what it felt like to imagine herself worthy of the very thing now being offered, with such earnest conviction, by a man who could have chosen anyone and yet knelt before her, asking her to be brave enough to reclaim the part of herself she had abandoned to circumstances and cruel necessity. She thought of the locked ballroom and how dancing in his arms had felt like coming home to a self she had believed lost forever, and she understood that accepting his proposal meant more than agreeing to marry a duke. It meant choosing to believe that she deserved joy and love and visibility, that her worth was inherent rather than determined by her position in a social hierarchy designed to keep people like her in their assigned places without hope of transcendence or transformation through the radical act of being truly seen and valued for who they actually were beneath the layers of protective invisibility. Her hands trembled as she reached down to touch his face with a gentleness born of wonder that such a moment could actually exist outside the realm of impossible dreams, and she spoke the word that required from her more courage than she had known she possessed. Yes. Sebastian rose and gathered her into his arms, while she wept against his chest with the release of years of suppressed hope and carefully guarded longing. And when he kissed her, it felt like a promise that they would face together whatever storms their choice would summon, because love this genuine and hard-won was worth any sacrifice that society might demand as payment for their transgression against its immutable laws. Their formal engagement was announced the following day, with a simplicity that belied the revolutionary nature of what Sebastian was declaring to his world, and though some quarters of society reacted with precisely the scandal and condemnation they had anticipated, there emerged from unexpected sources a quiet support from those who had themselves chafed against the rigid boundaries of class and propriety, or who simply recognized in their union something rare and precious enough to defend against the forces of conventional disapproval. As spring arrived at Ashworth Manor, bringing new life to gardens that had slept through winter's darkness, Eleanor and Sebastian navigated their engagement with a partnership that grew stronger through each challenge they faced together, and she discovered that choosing courage once made it easier to choose again and again, until the woman she was becoming bore little resemblance to the invisible governess who had once believed that happiness was a country whose borders she would never be permitted to cross. 3 months later, as summer bloomed across the English countryside, with a profusion of wildflowers that seemed to celebrate the impossible made manifest, Eleanor stood in the small chapel at Ashworth Manor, dressed in ivory silk that caught the light streaming through stained glass windows and transformed her into something luminous and almost otherworldly. And though the ceremony was modest by the standards of ducal weddings, attended by only those family members and friends who had chosen love over convention and who could witness their union with genuine joy rather than scandalized disapproval, there was a quality of sacredness to the occasion that no grand cathedral spectacle could have matched, because everyone present understood they were witnessing not merely a marriage, but a revolution of the heart that challenged every assumption about worthiness and belonging that their world had constructed to keep people confined within their designated spheres. Sebastian's mother had arrived the previous day with a stiffness that spoke of ongoing disapproval tempered by maternal devotion, and though she could not bring herself to offer Eleanor warmth, she had chosen presence over absence, a gesture that Eleanor received with quiet grace and without any expectation of more than time, might eventually soften into something approaching acceptance. Eleanor's own mother wept throughout the ceremony with tears that contained equal parts joy at her daughter's impossible good fortune and grief for all the years Eleanor had lived, believing such happiness was forever beyond her reach. And when Sebastian took Eleanor's hands in his and spoke his vows with a conviction that left no doubt about the depth of his commitment, Eleanor felt the last vestiges of the frightened governess she had been fall away like a chrysalis no longer needed to protect the woman she had become, through choosing courage over fear and hope over resignation. The wedding breakfast that followed was intimate and filled with genuine laughter rather than the performative gaiety that characterized most society celebrations, and when Sebastian led Eleanor onto the terrace where musicians had been arranged to play, she recognized with a thrill of profound emotion that this was the moment that would complete the transformation begun in a locked ballroom months earlier when he had first asked her to dance, and she had trembled with the terror allowing herself to be seen. This time when she took his hand, there was no trembling, no fear of witnesses or whispers, only the pure joy of dancing with the man she loved in full view of everyone who mattered, and as they waltzed beneath the summer sky, she met his eyes and saw reflected there the same wonder she felt at how far they had traveled together from that first stolen moment to this public celebration of a love that had required from both of them a willingness to risk everything for the possibility of genuine connection. Sebastian pulled her closer as they turned across the terrace and whispered against her ear that she was the most beautiful Duchess England had ever seen, and Eleanor laughed with a freedom she had never imagined possible, and told him that she was simply a woman who had finally learned she deserved to dance. And in the weeks and months that followed as they began their married life together, she discovered that her new position as Duchess of Ashworth brought with it not merely comfort and security, but opportunities to extend to other women difficult circumstances, the same kind of transformative kindness that Sebastian had shown her when he chose to see beyond the invisible governess to the substantial woman hidden beneath layers of protective resignation. She established a fund to support the education of young women who had lost their families and prospects, and she made it her personal mission to ensure that girls who might otherwise face lives of quiet desperation had access to the resources and opportunities that could allow them to choose their own paths rather than having those paths chosen for them by cruel circumstance. And Sebastian supported these endeavors not as dutiful husband indulging his wife's charitable whims, but as equal partner who had learned through loving Eleanor that worth was inherent rather than conferred by birth or station, that a society which failed to recognize this truth impoverished itself far more than it impoverished those it excluded from full participation in joy and possibility. 5 years later, as December returned to Ashworth Manor with the crystalline beauty of fresh snowfall that transformed the estate into something from a winter fairy tale, Eleanor stood in the grand ballroom that had once been the site of her transformation, watching the preparations for the annual Christmas ball with emotions so vastly different from those she had felt during that first winter when she had been merely the invisible governess who believed that joy and visibility belonged to others, while she remained forever in the careful shadows of her designated station. She wore sapphire silk that complemented the title she still sometimes marveled at possessing, and her hand rested on the shoulder of her daughter Catherine, who at 3 years old already showed signs of her mother's musical inclination and her father's unwavering conviction that the world existed to be engaged with rather than merely endured. While her son Edmund slept peacefully in the nursery under the watchful care of the young woman Eleanor had personally selected and trained, because she understood better than most the profound impact a governess could have on the children entrusted to her guidance. The ballroom filled gradually with guests who had learned over the years that invitations to the Ashworth Christmas ball came not merely from ducal obligation, but from genuine warmth, and Eleanor moved through the gathering with a grace that had nothing to do with the dancing lessons of her youth, and everything to do with the hard-won confidence of a woman who had chosen courage over fear and discovered that worthiness was something she possessed inherently rather than something that could be granted or revoked by the arbitrary judgments of a society that valued birth over character. Her gaze caught on a young woman standing near the musicians, with the particular stillness of someone trying very hard to remain unnoticed, and Eleanor recognized in that careful invisibility her own younger self, and felt her heart contract with compassionate understanding that transcended the years and circumstances that separated the Duchess she had become from the governess she had been. She approached the young woman with the gentle directness that had become her signature, and learned that her name was Miss Sarah Winters, governess to the Bartlett family who had arrived as guests. And when Sarah curtsied with the practiced deference of someone accustomed to effacing herself before her betters, Eleanor touched her arm and said with quiet conviction that she hoped Miss Winters would honor her by joining the dancing, because this was a celebration, and everyone present deserved to participate in joy, regardless of their position in the household hierarchy that so often determined who was permitted visibility and who was consigned to permanent shadows. The younger woman's shock and gratitude reminded Eleanor so powerfully of her own journey that she felt tears threaten, and when Sebastian appeared at her side with their daughter in his arms and understanding in his eyes that came from 5 years of the kind of partnership that deepened rather than diminished with time, Eleanor took his free hand and felt the familiar surge of wonder that this life was actually hers, that the impossible had become not merely possible, but wonderfully, miraculously real. They danced together as they had danced countless times since that first waltz in a locked ballroom, when everything had hung in precarious balance between hope and fear, and Eleanor met Sebastian's gaze and saw reflected there the same love that had given her courage to believe she deserved happiness, and she thought of all the women like her younger self who lived in careful invisibility, believing that joy belonged to others, and felt a renewed commitment to using her position to challenge the barriers that kept people confined within, limitations imposed by accident of birth rather than actual worth. The music swelled, and the candles cast their warm glow across faces, flushed with genuine pleasure, and Eleanor saw Miss Winters dancing with a young gentleman who had been convinced by Sebastian's quiet intervention that governesses were not invisible servants, but women of substance, deserving of attention and respect. And she felt in that moment the profound satisfaction of knowing that her own transformation had created ripples that extended far beyond her personal happiness into a broader challenge to the assumptions that had once seemed immutable and absolute. Dear listener, perhaps you too have stood in shadows, believing that joy and love and full participation in life's celebrations belong to others, while you remain carefully invisible in service to circumstances that seem beyond your control. And perhaps, like Eleanor, you have learned to protect yourself through lowered expectations and the careful management of hope, so that disappointment cannot shatter what little security you have managed to construct from the fragments, dreams abandoned to necessity and cruel fortune. But Eleanor's story whispers a different truth, one that challenges the boundaries we accept as permanent and the limitations we internalize as deserved, because worthiness is not something conferred by position or birth, but something inherent in the mere fact of your humanity. And the courage to believe you deserve joy is not presumption, but rather the reclamation of what was always rightfully yours before the world convinced you otherwise, through its arbitrary hierarchies and cruel indifference to individual worth. The barriers you face may seem insurmountable, and the voice that tells you to remain safely invisible may seem like wisdom rather than fear, but somewhere beyond your carefully constructed walls exists the possibility of transformation, and all it requires is the terrifying courage to say yes when happiness extends its hand and asks you to dance, to choose hope, even when every lesson life has taught you screams that hope is dangerous and disappointment is certain, to believe that you deserve to be seen and valued and loved, not despite who you are, but because of it. May you find your own locked ballroom where the world falls away and only truth remains. May you discover the courage Eleanor found to reclaim the part of yourself that believes in possibilities, and may you dance with the joy of someone who has finally learned that happiness is not a privilege reserved for others, but a birthright that belongs to you, as much as to anyone who has ever lived and loved and dared to imagine that life could be something more than careful survival in the shadows of other people's celebrations. May your nights be filled with peace, and may you rest in the knowledge that your story, like Eleanor's, is still being written, and the most beautiful chapters may yet lie ahead if only you are brave enough to turn the page. Thank you for listening to this story, brought to you by Love, Lies and Longing, where every tale reminds us that transformation is always possible and that sometimes the greatest revolution is simply believing you deserve to be happy.